Hello there, welcome once again to our science lesson. In our previous topic that we have just started in a new chapter, the topic is communities and environment. We stated that living organisms do not stay or live in an isolation. They usually live together with each other depending on other living organisms and also on the physical environment around them. So as they depend on each other, they'll form communities. And we said that communities are a group of organisms of different species that are usually living in the same habitat. A habitat being the home of that organism. Habitats usually have sets of conditions that usually favor the existence and survival of the organisms. And then we said that as they do live together, they'll interact with other living organisms and also the physical surrounding. The physical surrounding is what we call the environment. So we said that for us to understand or to get much from this topic or from this chapter, we need some prerequisite knowledge. Prerequisite knowledge. In other words, what we already know, what we can remember, or what we have experienced from our real life situations. And for us to get this, we were using some questions just to choke our mind so that we can remember what we have gone through experience, through self-reading, and through learning in previous levels. So we had a series of questions on the same. So our last question was on pyramids. Now we said that one very important material or some of the materials in the environment or what we call the ecosystem are mainly matter and energy. You can remember this. And we said that matter is mainly in form of nutrients. But we said that this matter usually flows through feeding levels. When one organism feeds on another, it allows transfer of matter from one feeding level to another. Those feeding levels, we gave them a very good name, a scientific name, trophic levels. And then we were able to find out that again, for ecosystem to be functional, it requires a source of energy. The major source of energy is usually the sun, which will be in form of solar energy. But for this energy to be incorporated into the ecosystem, producers, green plants, come into play through the process of photosynthesis, whereby they convert low energy carbon dioxide, low carbon energy carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. Carbohydrates. This is low energy. In other words, the energy content in terms of calories that exist in carbon dioxide is lower, but carbohydrates have high calorific values, high energy. For this to happen, sunlight is important, and that process of conversion of carbon dioxide, which is a low energy molecule, to high energy compound, carbohydrates, is called photosynthesis. So you can remember this. But again, we say that the flow of energy and matter through trophic levels can be given a pictorial representation, such that if we start with the largest trophic level, which are the producers, we can have or draw or develop a histogram for that. If we develop a histogram, horizontal histogram, like that for producers, then energy captured in producers are being allowed to flow to primary consumers. Now the histogram will be slightly smaller in size, that is the primary consumers. And then another histogram where it's now allowing energy to flow from primary consumers to another trophic level, secondary consumer. And then this energy being allowed to flow to the last trophic level, tertiary consumers. So what we have formed here is a pyramid. You can see that as you go up the trophic level, the size, the number of organisms or the biomass of organisms is decreasing. So in this form, we developed what we call a pyramid. And what is this pyramid? We are using two parameters to construct the pyramids, either biomass, or if you can also count the numbers at each trophic level. So you can have a pyramid of biomass or pyramid of numbers. So you just count the number of producers in a given ecosystem. If you are going to use the numbers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, you develop the histogram horizontally instead of them having a vertical view, or you can use biomass. So in the end, you have a pictorial representation showing amount of matter at each of the trophic level. And it's very easy to find out that as you go up the trophic level, the amount of energy usually decreases. We shall find out that. So at the end of it, pyramids are pictorial representations. Pictorial representations of flow of matter or energy through different trophic levels. Different trophic levels. We have already said that the most important material in the ecosystem are mainly matter and energy. It is this energy from the sun that will form matter, and then or some of the matter is in form of inorganic, is already present in the ecosystem. So if we do a representation like this, it forms a pyramid. We can have two types, pyramid of biomass and pyramid of numbers. If it is biomass, we are using the dry weight. We use dry weight of each of these organisms or trophic levels to draw the histograms. If they are numbers, we are just counting. You count directly the number, or you determine the number of organisms at each trophic level, and then develop histograms for the same. But there's something worth noting on this pyramid, that the number of organisms, if it was pyramid of biomass, usually decreases. The number of organisms decreases up the pyramid. So why is it that it decreases up the pyramid? I think in our previous lesson, we were able to touch slightly on this. We said that the energy that is present in producers is not transferred wholly, efficiently, or 100% to the next trophic level. We usually have energy losses. There is loss of energy. Loss of energy as it is transferred from one trophic level to another. Now, some of the processes that occasion the loss of this energy we were able to slightly mention include respiration. Now, in other words, if we have the sun now, maybe 100, it's not even 100%, because if this is the sun, some of the energy in the sun will be lost in the atmosphere. So just a small percent will get into the producer. Suppose you start with 100% at that point, 100% getting to the producers. Energy will be lost, one, through respiration. Other processes include defecation. So in respiration, for instance, plants usually carry out respiration, and one of the product of respiration is heat energy. That heat energy will be lost to the surrounding by processes like convection, radiation, and conduction. And then if, for instance, we are looking at primary consumers, if they consume producers, look at an elephant. If you look at the stool or feces of the elephant, you realize that you'll get there twigs of vegetation, which means the vegetation that was taken in through the digestive system was not effectively converted into absorbable material that could have been used to be incorporated into the tissues of the elephant. So realize that through defecation, again, some of the energy is lost. Other processes also include reproduction. During reproduction, some energy is going to be consumed. For instance, if there are animals where we have reproduction, you realize that if it is sexual reproduction where sperm and ova is involved, for the sperm to move, it requires energy. Some of the energy will be used. Therefore, because of these processes that are leading to loss of energy from one trophic level to another, what is realized is that it's only 10% of energy from each trophic level is transferred to the next trophic level. But most of the energy is lost to the surrounding. So the other bits that we can look at, the other question, name some ecosystems found in Australia. Name some ecosystems found in Australia. Now remember, we said an ecosystem is a self-sustaining collection of both living organisms and non-living factors. It becomes self-sustaining because they depend on each other and also on the environment. Just like in a fish pond, we shall have different animals and different environment that will come together so that it can now help that organism to be able to survive properly. So ecosystems found in Australia, there are many. We can look at, for instance, forests, forest ecosystem. We have grassland ecosystem. Sometimes called savanna. We have woodland ecosystem. So they are self-explanatory. If it is forest ecosystem, it means that environment is majorly a forest, more trees above maybe 10 acres. We call that one a forest, where we have a land that has uniform distribution of trees. They could be of different sizes, of different species, but above 10 acres, we call that one as a forest. Grassland ecosystem, different types of grass, woodland, you'll find scattered trees, maybe in a given area. We have shrubland ecosystem, the heath ecosystem, and mangroves or mangrove ecosystem. Then another question, name some species that have been introduced in Australia and have caused problems for the native plants and animals. Name some species that have been introduced in Australia and have caused problems to native plants and animals. Have caused problems to native plants and animals. So this question is asking us about some special kind of flora and fauna that when introduced into their non-native environment, they usually cause problems to the native flora and fauna, plants and animals. In other words, we call this type of species as invasive species. Invasive species. They are able to outcompete the existing plants, and in the process, they either cause the wiping out of the plants or even extinction of the animals that were present in that ecosystem before their introduction. Now, some introduction could be deliberate by human effort, deliberate through human efforts. We have seen this. Maybe an ornamental plant has been introduced into an area, and in the process, it grows so fast, outcompeting the rest and causing extinction of the plants that were there. But in some other cases, it could be through other means, like through floods carrying plants from some area in form of seeds, in form of seedling, in form of roots, or any other vegetative materials. And in the process, when they establish themselves, they are so firm, they are so competitive, and in the process, they outcompete the existing plants and animals. Now, for us to answer this question, we shall divide them into two categories: plants that are invasive, plants that are invasive. We are going to look at some examples here. We have an example like the paragrass. Now, the paragrass was introduced deliberately in Australia to act as a pasture around the fish ponds. But in the process, it was able to outcompete the existing plants around, and it has caused major problems, like even causing blocking of tropical streams, because it is highly versatile, growing very fast, and in the process taking over the ecosystem of the streams. And also it has led to extinction of other plants, extinction of other plants. Now we have some animals that usually depend on these plants. So as the plants disappear, extinction means disappearing completely from the face of the earth. As the plants disappear, also that animals that live off these plants will also continue to decline and in the process decrease or even reach extinction levels. Other examples include the rubber vine. The rubber vine. This one has destroyed riparian vegetations, has led to destruction of riparian vegetation. What is a riparian vegetation? For instance, if we have a stream ecosystem, you will find that we have vegetation that usually grows just close to the flooding basins of the stream or river. We call that one as riparian vegetation. But with the introduction of the rubber vine, the riparian vegetation could not compete favorably with the same. And in the process, it has replaced nearly all native riparian vegetation along major streams in Australia. Others include water hyacinths, Iconia craspes. The other name is Iconia craspes. Iconia craspes is a scientific name, so you are supposed to underline it, Iconia craspes. This has become a very major problem, especially in open waters. Open waters like the lakes, like some huge water reservoirs, and even in some seas. So water hyacinth has high ability of reproduction, and also it can stay in seed form for a very long time, dormance. It has high or long duration of dormance. Even after wiping all the water hyacinths, the vegetative part, sometimes we shall have the seeds that will stay for a longer time without actually dying. So whenever appropriate conditions are available, the seeds usually germinate to form the water hyacinths. Now, it has been also a very serious problem in other developing countries, like in Kenya. There's a lake called Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. There's a lake called Lake Victoria, which has been invaded with water hyacinths. And indeed, it has become a major problem, blocking the major ways through which the boats and several other vessels are supposed to travel through. So there are several examples. We can just look at a few, and then the other one is Lantana camara. Lantana camara. This one again is highly invasive, growing very fast, growing even during dry seasons when conditions are not very conducive for other plants, but having the ability to grow when those conditions are harsh. So these are some of the examples of plants that are invasive. They have really caused problems to the native plants. And then B, we can look at animals. Now, most of the invasive animals are usually feral animals. Feral. So the catch word there is feral. Feral. Now, a feral animal is that animal that was once domesticated. It was once a domestic animal. It was once domesticated, but it breaks away from domestication, it goes into the wild, and then in the wild it begins to reproduce. So you realize that if it was domesticated and is in the wild reproducing, the offsprings now becomes wild. So it is transforming itself from being domesticated to being a wild animal or a wild life. So we call that kind of an animal as feral animals. So most of the invasive animals have been feral animals. Maybe they were introduced as pets or as other animals for other purposes, like the camel. But now it runs away from the confines of domestication to become a wild animal. So examples of these feral animals include one, the feral cat. This is very common. The feral cat. The feral cat, also called the Felis catus. Felis catus. Felis catus is a scientific name. Others include the feral camel. The feral camel. We have the European rabbit. We have the European fox. European fox, and also the feral pig. So we cannot look at each one of them, but slightly if it is a cat, a feral cat, once domesticated but runs into wild and is transformed into a wild animal, we realize that being a carnivore, any native mammal that will be born around it, especially for lambs, for instance lambs, they're not going to survive because of the cat. The camel, because this is very common in desert and semi-arid environment, semi-arid conditions. So if it goes into the wild, it's not controlled. What will happen, any vegetation that's found in this area, the semi and desert conditions, is going to be consumed. In fact, the one that has caused more problems is the European rabbit. The European rabbit has caused problems majorly on vegetation. Vegetation. How? Because in the wild, it's not provided with food, but it has to look for its own food. So most of the time, if that's the tree, it will start depacking, removing the bark from the trees. Removing the bark from the trees. So we call that process as debarking. When there's no bark, what happens is that it interferes with translocation of manufactured food from the leaves to other parts of the plants, roots inclusive. So it has affected vegetation through debarking, also interferes with regeneration of vegetation by feeding on seeds. When the seeds from the tree fall on the ground, they are eaten by the rabbits. And then, if you are going to have some seeds surviving to germinate into seedlings, the seedlings are also eaten. If you have roots that will vegetatively become other plants, are also going to be fed on by the rabbits. And one important characteristic of these rabbits is that they have high reproductive, or they are highly fertile. They can produce over a short period of time. You'll find that the population has increased so much. So as they increase, the effect on vegetation also increases. The European fox it has the same effect as that one of the cat. The feral pig, it has also the same effect as those one of the rabbits, because they actually fall in the same category in terms of trophic level. The other bit, you can also look at this 13. What is an ecological community? What is an ecological community? So this question is not difficult. All we have to understand is the meaning of a community. Now, wherever you are already in a community because you are living with different people, but at the same time, you also have other animals around you. You can be able to look around. Maybe if it is a farmland, you have cattle, we have sheep, we have goats. And suppose we are using an example of a game park. In the game park, we have high biological diversity. It's rich in species. You'll find that in the park we have animals like elephants, we have buffaloes, we have zebras, we might have antelopes, you might have the cat family lions, fox, and the apes, monkey. The list can go on and on. All these organisms are found in the same habitat, game park, but they belong to different species. So if we have organisms of different species being found in the same habitat, then we call that one as an ecological community. Different species of organisms found in the same habitat. It is an ecological community. So in a note form, we have said is where different species of organisms are found in the same habitat. So the word found here in this statement is equivalent to, we can equate it, could be synonymous with living, not just being found today and then they migrate. No, they live in the same habitat. We have already found out the meaning of a habitat. A habitat is the home of an organism. Why home? Because it has sets of conditions that allow survival of the organism. So because of that, we call it a home, we call it a habitat. Conditions like maybe breeding sites are present, we have security is there, they cannot be fed on very easily. If they're antelopes, they're slightly safe, and if it is food, it's available. If it is water, it's also available. So those are some of the conditions we are looking at. (14) What is an environment? An environment. We have already come across this. This is not the first time. We have said that an environment is the immediate surrounding of an organism. that surrounding could be living or non-living or both. Like wherever you are right now, I know that is your environment. There could be some people around you which represents living organism, or you could have others like pets. There's a cat maybe around you, there's a dog next to you, or you can look at other factors that are non-living like chairs, even the walls if you are inside a building. That is your environment. So when you talk of environment, is all non-living and living surrounding of an organism. So the living, non-living, whatever we have been able to mention as, even your set, if you are on your laptop, that is non-living. If you are on that chair, on that table, that is non-living. Living, yourself, other people around you, those are living surroundings. So living and non-living surrounding. And as we go on with the topic, we realize that environment has a lot of influence on distribution of organisms, because if, for instance, that we have living organism, if it's an antelope, and then close to it we have predators, the lions. If they increase in number, if the lions increase in number, more of the antelopes will be fed on, and in the process, the population of the antelopes is going to decrease. So that's why we have to know the terms as we move towards the real concepts. Then 15, what is a predator-prey relationship? So for us to get it properly, we have to know the meanings of the two words. It's one word, but from two terms. When you talk of a predator, we have already looked at the trophic levels. Most of the predators will be consumers, but secondary, tertiary consumers. So a predator is that tertiary, secondary consumers that usually feeds on the prey, and prey are usually primary consumers. So this is that organism that's fed on. Predator is that organism that usually feeds. It feeds on. But prey is fed on. Is fed on. Predator feeds on. So because of that, predator will be found either as a secondary consumer, or will be found as a tertiary consumer, will be classified as a tertiary consumer. Being fed on, the prey will be the primary consumer mostly. So in other words, the prey most of the time is a herbivore. Most of the time. But even the vulture can feed on a lion. So most of them are herbivores. I've used the word most. And then most of the predators are carnivores. Carnivores. So for this purpose, we usually have two types of carnivores. Carnivore 1 is the secondary consumer. Carnivore 2, this one forms carnivore 1. Carnivore 1, secondary consumers, the dogs, the fox. Secondary consumers forms carnivore 2. Carnivore 2, the vultures, at tertiary level. So tertiary consumers will become tertiary depending on the chain. If it becomes the fourth consumer or the fourth in the trophic level, it becomes the tertiary consumer. So when you talk of predator-prey relationship, is that relationship between that organism, that carnivore that feeds on another organism, usually a primary consumer. So we can have a ground definition as this is where carnivore feeds on another organism, most of the time usually a herbivore. So that last part may change if, for example, that carnivore is feeding on a lower carnivore at the secondary consumer trophic level. So it may change. For instance, we can give an example, e.g., when a lion feeds on antelope, lion feeding on antelope, that simplifies or exemplifies a predator-prey relationship. Now, this predator-prey relationship is also given another one word. We call that phenomenon as. We call this phenomenon as predation. Predation, where a predator feeds on a prey. But because those are the same words that are used, we need to find other words where carnivore, it could be carnivore 1, carnivore 2, feeding on another animal, which is mainly primary consumer, the herbivores. Although I've said this may change. This may change depending on what the carnivore is feeding on. The carnivore can feed on another carnivore. So the carnivore that feeds on another carnivore becomes carnivore 1, tertiary consumer, and then the other carnivore becomes secondary consumer. (16) A parasite. What is a parasite? So we have come across this, that sometimes you have gone to hospital and then you are diagnosed of a disease and you are told that maybe you have some parasites in your body. Or even in a real life situation, if we have animals around you like pets, sometimes you'll find a pet like a dog or a cat having a parasite on it, like lice, or sometimes even tick on a cow, or sometimes tapeworms in your digestive system. That one becomes a parasite. So you realize that the parasite is that organism that is either living in or on. It could be inside the body or on the body, and depends on that other organism for other benefits like shelter, like nutrients, even sometimes protection. So in the process, we call that organism as a parasite. Is an organism which lives, it could be in or on another organism, and depends on it. Depends on it for several benefits, depends on it for shelter, for nutrients, and even protection. So as it is obtaining all this from that other organism, the other organism is going to be harmed, and in the process, and causes harm to the other organism. So it makes the other organism to lose. The nutrients that were meant for that organism are going to go into another organism or to be obtained by another organism. So that organism that is dependent on for all this and the one that loses is called the host. So that organism which lives on or another organism and depends on it for shelter, nutrients, and protection sometimes, and in the process causes harm to that organism, is called a parasite. We have several examples, but this relationship is usually referred to as parasitism. Parasitism. Now, we can give examples from wherever you are. You can also, if you are getting some notes, you can be able to give some examples or write down some few examples. So one of the example may be a tick on a cow. It's very common. Maybe you can talk of tapeworm in digestive system, in the gut of human beings or any other animal. We have others like Plasmodium. Plasmodium parasite in the blood system of human beings and other animals. Plasmodium, these are a very important parasite. Why is it important? Is of medical importance because it's the major cause of the tropical disease called malaria. Then 17, very important process. What is pollution? What is pollution? Now, when you talk of pollution, is the introduction of harmful substances into the environment that may interfere with the normal functioning of the ecosystem. Pollution is a very wide concept. It's the introduction of harmful substances. Harmful substances into the ecosystem and in the process interferes. And in the process interferes with the normal functioning. With normal functioning of organisms. Now we have different forms of pollution. If, for example, there is introduction of chemicals, it could be in form of release of chemicals from plants, in other words, from factories, from hospitals, and any other places like farms. We are going to call that one as pollution. Some of the chemicals include insecticides, and several others, fungicides, and the rest. Several. It could also be in form of noise. We can have noise pollution and several others. Then the other question, as we move on, pollination, number 18. What is pollination? Now, from other previous levels, you have also come across the term pollination. So when you talk of pollination, the first thing that should come in our minds are flowers. Flowers on plants, either of the same species or the same plants or different plants, but of the same species. So the first thing that should come in our mind is flowers. But these flowers are producing some structures that are minute called pollen grains. But the source of pollen grains, we know that on the flower, the major or the site that produces pollen grains are the structures called anthers. But where will the pollen grains land? They are going to land on stigma of a flower. So when you talk of pollination, these terms should be able to guide us to come up with the correct definition. So if you are going to have transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of a flower of the same plant, could be of the same plant or of different plants, but these plants, these two, should be of the same species, then we call that one as pollination. So in other words, we cannot have pollen grains being transferred from, for instance, maize plants to bean plants, and then you call that one as pollination. Nothing has happened. Pollination has not taken place if we are having transfer of the pollen grains from maize to beans, because they are of different species. So it must be of the same species. So if we note down the definition, then it becomes is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to stigma of a flower on the same plant or a different plant, but the plants should be of the same species, So in this definition, we can have two other forms of pollination. So same species is very key as you define the meaning of pollination. So in this statement, we can have two categories of pollination. So if the others are, the pollen grains are from the others to the stigma of the same flower of the same plant, then call that one as, or from of the same flower of the same plant, we call that one as self-pollination. Because it is within the same parent which is the same plant. But if those pollen grains will cross to another plant, to the stigma of another flower of a different plant but of the same species, then we call that one as cross-pollination. So self-pollination, we have the same flower, that is the stigma, that is the anther, but pollen grains come from that, landing on that stigma. For cross-pollination, we have different flowers So we have pollen grains from these answers to the stigma from this answer of plant A. And then this is plant B, crossing to the stigma of a different flower on a different plant. We call that one as cross-pollination. So at a higher level, you are going to find out how self-pollination and cross-pollination are going to vary and how important they are. The other question, 19, which is linked to the same, name some insect pollinators. Insect pollinators. Insect pollinators. So in other words, you just mention some of the examples of insects in the ecosystem. That's the environment. Remember, we have been talking about environment. The insects are part of the environment. They are even helping plants to carry pollen grains, transfer pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of same or different flower. The examples are wide. We have bees, we have the beetles, even flies. Flies as they forage. We have seen very beautiful insects of different colors moving from one flower to another. Butterflies, we have moths. So as they move from one flower to another, what happens? Some of the pollen grains are sticky and heavy. They usually attach themselves on the bodies of these insects as they forage. And in the process, when, for instance, the bee is obtaining nectar from a different flower, it's going to deposit those pollen grains on the stigma of a different flower. So that movement from one flower to another as the insects obtain nectar or other materials, we call that process as foraging. Moving from one flower to another. So I think with that, now we have prerequisite knowledge. We are going to do some few things before now we begin the main concept on the topic, just one or two, and then we shall move on very well. So once we have this information, then the chapter Communities and Environment will be a very easy journey for you as we move on. So thank you for listening and continue looking at the previous parts so that we are acquainted better for the topic ahead. Thank you.